conclusion within a reasonable period of time. Doesn't always happen, but that's the ideal, is what you're shooting for. It's still a very difficult decision to make as to how you do that, and to some extent it depends too on what your CV looks like. I mean, you can look realistically at your own CV and say, does it need quality or quantity? Now, ideally it has both, but we don't live in an ideal world. And you want to be careful that you don't make it such a small contribution that it only gets in some place that where no one's ever going to read it. So if it never ever gets cited or read, then...
Isn't it dependent on the results that are in the paper? Because technically, I mean, if you have a finding in the paper, from biologist standpoint, whether you publish it in JV or virus research, if they both referenced in PubMed, and if people are looking for the specific piece of information, they will find it, they will reference it.
Well, I can guarantee you they're more likely to reference something in general virology than virus research. And that has a lot to do with impact factor. And generally speaking, the lower down the scale we go in impact factor of a journal, the overall lower quality of the other papers in that journal are likely to be. Nothing's absolute. There are perfectly terrible papers that are published in extremely high impact journals and vice versa. But we're just talking about general things. And how impact facts are calculated are sometimes a bit weird too. And there are several different ways of doing it. At the Journal of Virology Editors meeting last fall, we had a big discussion about this, and it's really some of the ways that they're calculated is very confusing to figure out. That number is one that you need to hang on particularly, because in general, if you're in a field, you know who thinks it's a really good journal and who thinks it's an okay journal and who thinks it's a last resort journal. And if you kind of think of them like that, and there are times when a last resort journal is something you want to do. I mean, and again, your own circumstances dictate some of this. If you're in an institution where they've got a number of number crunchers, right? Well, some institutions, say you work on a tenure track position, and years ago I was at the Institute at the University of Florida, and they had a rule there that you had to publish a certain number of papers in order to get tenure.
I think it's the same here.
No, there's no absolute rule. And so if you were short of that number, then it was pretty important that you get something out no matter what. Right? But if you are at many institutions now, they will take a lot more account of the impact factor of the journals that you're publishing. So you can publish 5 papers in virus research or 1 paper in PLOS pathogens, and they'll pay a lot more attention to the PLOS pathogens. And unfortunately, it's always true that people who are making decisions about promotion and tenure typically don't know anything about what you're doing and don't read your papers. So they're going to be they're very much dependent on what the referees are going to tell them about that quality. And if they haven't done a good job, or the chair or whatever hasn't done a good job of getting referees, then it's likely that the people on the P&T committee are going to start bitching and moaning about he's only got 2 papers here, and so if it was somewhere there, so well, what's any good, this is just not productive enough. You know, even if you've done, you know, a Nobel Prize,
Right.
this wasn't productive enough. You know, so, and you're always at the mercy of that kind of stuff. I don't know if there's any easy way to avoid that. But so I guess the answer is, like in most things in life, you have to try and keep a balance and use your judgment about every individual piece of work. And I don't think you can't say never publish a small piece of work or always go for the highest impact journal, or you know, you've got to just look realistically at what it is you got and what's realistic about.
But what if you have a project and you think, okay, I can get well, I'm going to talk virology terms because it's slightly easier for me now. Still, virology. I can get a paper for Journal of Virology now, or I don't know, in a month. Or it seems that if I'll work for another, I don't know, 8 months, I'll be able to send it to PNAS.
But you're then risking being scooped.
Yep. Yep, I understand. But so that's.
So how novel it is if you're the first one to make a discovery, how to try to go with a smaller paper. If it is novel, and after that you can, because you put your name on that topic, and after that you can make it broad as, you can make like 100 pages, it doesn't matter, but you were the first one to make a statement and discovery. I would always go with a smaller paper.
Good point. Good point.
Well,
I'm proposing the situation.
there are two views as well on that. Actually, I did it to Mindy one of them, my postdoc. Read it. A fellow called The Mole. I don't know if he still writes, but he used to write a column in the Journal of Cell Science and addressed an issue in Science. And this was I reviewed paper for them some time, and they sent me this as a kind of gift. People don't usually send you gifts for reviewing things, but and it's a small collection of his and he has 2 of them which actually address what to do with your scoop. And that's why I wish I had it, but I say she's got it right now. And it's whether you're over-scooped or under-scooped. and how you deal with them differently. The under-scoop is the person who publishes a small bit of stuff that is an interesting finding. It's not particularly well done, but he's first. That one you kind of address differently than the one where you had this great piece of work, and just as you were about to publish it, the other guy did. That's sort of being over-scooped. And he was, I can remember from the over-scoop, he said, there's almost always some other important next experiment that you thought of. You've already got all that data that has been scooped. So now you do that extra important experiment, and then you write your paper in which you show all the data that you originally had that confirms this important paper, and then you add to it. And that you can still do. I think he used to say the underscoop is a little more difficult to deal with, although again, you could still go ahead and do your substantial piece of work, and I guess you still have the option of sort of pointing out how much better it is. But yeah, it's difficult. You do have that risk.
If you go for the.
If you're going for a very, if you're hanging around for a long period of time. And that's something that always is breathing down. If you think you've got something that's going to be, have a fairly high impact, that is something that's always kind of breathing down the back of your neck. I'm not going to get screwed. Because, I mean, basically, there is no new idea in the world. You thought of it, somebody else did too. And it's only, you look at how many high impact discoveries are published in papers from completely different groups that are back to back. Right? Just because that's where the field was at the time. Yeah. That was the next obvious set of things to do, and they did it. So it's not an easy question to answer, and it's one I think you have to take on an individual basis and each situation. You probably in your field have some kind of field. Now, this isn't always true. You can get completely blindsided, but you very often have some kind of idea of who's likely to be out there doing something similar.
Mm-hmm.
That's why people, who are doing that kind of work very often can be very circumspect when they go to meetings, because you don't want to give too much away. And opening your mouth too much at a meeting can be a bad thing to do. Which is not particularly helpful to science as a whole, actually.
Because you come to the meeting and you see data that you can read about.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a good thing as a whole, but it's fact of life, really. I mean, ideally, everybody shares everything. And there is some move. I'm reading something about this in the last couple of days. I think it might have been, I think it was in the science section of the New York Times yesterday, that there is a big move afoot, particularly in some fields, I think more like mathematics and physics, to go to non-peer-reviewed online publishing, so that everybody just shares everything instantly. Now that has distinct consequences for how things pan out in their career. But the suggestion is that may be far more of a wave of the future than what we have now, which is this very gatekeepered system of review and of rejection and acceptance.
Yes.
Which is sort of what P+1 tried to get around a little bit.
But they still have reviewers.
They still have reviewers. Well, they review for scientific accuracy.
Not
for impact. So if you've done something and it's not repeating what somebody else has done and you've done it properly, then as far as they're concerned, that meets our criteria. At least that's what they say in their blurb. Yeah. And they tell reviewers what to do. So I don't know. I think things may change a lot in the next 10 years, maybe. With a lot more open access.
Yeah, that's what I heard about this math papers that are published on arXiv.org. They pretty much publish the evidence, new work in math, and people can check it for accuracy before it is published in the actual journal. And often they find flaws and mistakes in actual.
Right, you find flaws and mistakes in journals in papers that have been reviewed.
Well, in biology it's a bit different, because you can say, okay, this might have been done better and this might have been done better, but we still consider it as a valid result. While in the math, I mean, if it's a mistake, it just, everything's over, you have to start again.
Yeah, think of any theorem. Most of that's totally beyond me. I said most of that's totally beyond me. So that was how to choose the journal impact factor versus area of interest versus open access.
Well, it's pretty much
easier to publish, which is basically the same thing. Impact's probably the most important, but be realistic. You can waste. I've seen a lot of people at the beginning of their careers come out of, say, high-powered postdoc labs, where they're used to publishing in very high-profile journals. And they'll go out on their own, and they'll think, well, I can't possibly publish it if it's not in Science or Nature or something like that. So they'll waste a lot of time submitting their papers to Science and Nature. And they all claim that they deal with things quickly, and mostly they don't. And so their work kind of languishes in an interminable review process. And then finally, at the last minute, their chairman says to them, look, you're coming up for tenure next week, get this published. You know? Then you have to get it back somewhere fast. So that can be a real danger if you're not realistic about where you can publish. Okay, try a high impact journal first, if you like. But if it comes back, and the sort of writing is on the wall, don't waste any more time. Just get on and publish it somewhere respectable and move on. Because otherwise you will end up with sort of one paper, which is kind of a kiss of death.
Is it a myth that PLOS, journals, myth or true, are easier to publish in? Then let's say the regular, no.
Yeah. Depends on the journal. PLOS pathogens is very difficult to publish.
Okay.
Now, I mean, that happens to be the one that I know most about. It's now considered a very high impact journal. I mean, that would be a journal that people would go to as they would go to, maybe not quite PDA, but close. But some of the other PLOS journals are probably less so. And I don't know that much about ones in, presumably there's a PLOS chemistry or a PLOS, I really don't know anything about that. PLOS 1 is much easier for the reasons that I said, but PLOS pathogens is a very difficult journal to get into.
So it actually very much differs.
Yeah. Which part of the manuscript is better to be written first? Well, there's actually only one part of the manuscript you should write first. The part that you should write first is you should put your figures and your tables together so you know what the hell it is you're going to be talking about. And chances are, when you put together your figures and your tables, you'll take one look at them and think, oh. And let it go back to the lab. And then when you finally got it all together, you get your figures and your tables first and you write the results section. Because now you know what it is you're going to be talking about. Until you do that, you have no idea what you're going to be talking about. You might have a vague idea about what you think you might be going to talk about, but that's what you're going to be talking about. And what you have to do there is you have to tell a story. Okay? You don't necessarily put in figure 1 what you did first. Right? What you did first may have not really made any sense at all, and you did something else, and then you did something else, and you thought, oh, I bet that's what figure 1 was, but what I thought about first. So really what it means is that I thought of this question, and I thought of that question, and then that led me to this question. And so even if you did that bit first, you don't talk about it first, you try and make it sound like you had a brilliantly thought out strategy for doing this whole piece of work. And this is exactly how you did it. I mean, it's not lying. You did the work, it's just not the order in which you did it. Right? And so it's crucial to do that, because otherwise the reader's never going to get, and the first reader is the reviewer, is never going to get, wow, how did they do this? This is not going to, and they did this, then they did that, and then he came back and they did this. How confused is this person? I mean, so you've got to tell a story. And when you've got that together, right, now you know what you're going to say. You know what this whole paper is going to be like. So now you either write the discussion or you write the introduction. And I have a tendency to write the introduction last, because by the time you've written the results and the discussion, you know exactly where you want to tell people this was going. So now you can tell them what was known in the field, what the problem is, what was known, what you needed to do, And in the introduction, you probably also give them a brief summary of what you found. You don't discuss it. You don't interpret it. Or you could put, some brief concluding remark. We think these results imply such and such. But you don't discuss. You save that for the discussion itself. But that introduction then sets up what you were going to do. And it justifies what you did, even if that isn't really why you did it in the first place to begin with. Nobody knows that. No, nobody ever did the experiments in a paper in the order in which they figured it. You know that. So you just got to find the nicest way to put it together.
That's a discussion question.
The discussion, yeah. The discussion, you've got to be really careful. Don't simply tell the reader what they just read in the results. You don't need to do that. There are no end of discussions that will come in and they'll say, we showed in figure so-and-so, and in figure so-and-so we showed. Wait a minute, I just read all this. Get over it. Okay, you have a brief paragraph, right?
That states.
You outline, the crucial issue and sort of summarizes in a couple of sentences what you just told them in detail, right? And then you go on and put that in the context of everything else. Okay? I've made these findings. So how do they illuminate what people have already found? How do they suggest that what people have already found is correct, or see it in a new light that might lead us in another direction? And yes, you could speculate, but you need to speculate to provoke thought, not merely to go on and show that I can think of other things too, and by the time I finish my postdoc I think I'll do this and this and this, and this is my future directions, and we don't need to know that. You need to know you need to make sure that all the potential implications of what you have found are expressed.
How far can you go?
Well,
Do you have in mind a journal before you start writing or after you start writing?
Oh boy. I've done it both ways. I've done it where I've just written a paper and then looked at it and said where does this belong?
But then you get to reformat, right?
Yeah, but that's not really an issue. If the methods go at the end instead of the beginning, and the references are different, we use a reference manager anyway these days. And I always try to put my references in as I write, rather than go back. But that's just personal. 20 years ago, reformatting would have been a big issue, but it really isn't now with computers.
So it doesn't matter?
No, I don't think so. You don't have to make minor adjustments, obviously.
Yeah. But sometimes, the research, you may feel like this work just calls for a specific journal.
Yeah.
Like in immunology, like if I would be doing epigenetic work or something, then it's basically, at least if I would want a high impact journal, I would want it in immunity, which does all that kind of work. Well, it would be very inappropriate to try to submit it to Journal of Experimental Medicine, because even though it's a high impact immunology journal, that's just not their stuff.
Yeah. So you're going to have to use your own knowledge of the field, or if you don't feel that you have that knowledge, then that's the responsibility of the other people.
But some journals will tell you that this paper is okay, but doesn't belong. We had this issue. We sent the paper to JID, Journal of Infectious Diseases, and they say nothing to do with the quality of the paper, but it's not a disease. I mean, you're talking about modal, but it's not clinical, so go ahead and send it somewhere else.
And that's sometimes an editorial decision. That's sometimes an editorial decision that's made without even sending it out for review.
We have
They
received,
just look at it and say, you know,
yeah, we have received this response in 2 hours after the paper was submitted.
oh, I'll get a paper for JV and I'll look at it and say, this should go in a clinical micro journal. It doesn't belong in a, you know, in a journal that's focusing on basic mechanisms. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with it necessarily. And that there is in all the ASM journals have an ability to transfer from one editor-in-chief to another. Though it has to go through the editor-in-chief, not just the editor. I mean, I think you typically ask the author somewhere along the way if that's okay with them, if they're okay with the other journal. You find out the other editor would consider it appropriate.
So then, a little bit related to this, writing of a cover letter.
Yeah.
When you are, trying to convince the editor that this, belongs in their journal, or how any specific strategies in doing that, or what are the pointers that you recommend in doing so?
Well, the cover letter, it depends on the journal. If you're writing for Nature Medicine, something like that, then the cover letter, and in particular the abstract, is absolutely critical. If the abstract doesn't grab them, they're not going to bother. They're not going to do it. In general, to many journals, the cover letter to the editor is just kind of a pro forma thing. In fact, I sometimes have to remind myself to go back and actually read it and see, they didn't say anything particularly different than, just say, I want this paper reviewed. So that very much is going to depend on the kind of journal it is. And very often with the high impact journals like Nature or Nature Medicine, when you actually do a pre-submission, so to speak. You send in information and they'll tell you exactly what they want to know. They'll want to know that kind of justification for why you think it belongs there, and the abstract, and then they'll just look at that and then decide if they're going to proceed to review. I don't know. I don't think JX Men does that. Could be wrong. But that's going to what you're going to have to do there is, first of all, what you have to do with everything is go online and read the instructions to the authors, and you'd be surprised the number of people that don't do that. Well, it's like people write grants without reading the instructions. I presume people fill out their tax forms without reading instructions. It's all the same. The instructions are there for a reason.
Going back to discussion, so how far, what I'm trying to say, I may not explain it clear, but you have certain findings and you have other findings in the field, and you can quite easily see immediate conclusions when you combine all the data that you have from your work, from other work, from work of other people. You can say, okay, that's what it looks like now. But what if you would say, okay, we can hypothesize that there are a couple more things happening. Nobody showed it, but it's sort of a common sense. And then it would implicate this and this going on. How normal is that?
Oh, it's fairly normal. Now, what happens to that is going to depend entirely on the review. On the editor reviewer. Some reviewers get very incensed at speculation, and other people find that, it's fine. But it will also depend a little bit on the journal itself. Some journals will allow more that kind of leeway than others. The main thing to remember is however speculative you are, don't be verbose. Don't go on. Keep it concise and to the point. Because if you just go on, if you have pages and pages of potential thoughts, that's going to go. That's going to go. In general, you want to try and keep your manuscript as short as possible. And it's just very clear. Notice when you go to the high impact journals, they catch you down to the bone. It's one reason why it's much more difficult to write for those kinds of journals. Now, they get around a lot of stuff by allowing you to have supplemental data online these days, which I find extraordinarily irritating. Because it's never in the same place. You know, if it's really important, to my way of thinking, it should be in the damn paper. But you know, that's the way they want to do it. So at JV, for example, we have a policy where the only things you're allowed to put in supplemental data are primer sequences, you know, which nobody really cares about unless you read it. Microarray data, you know, huge data sets, huge sequence sets or something, things that just, or videos, right? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. You're not going to be able to put it in the paper. But you're not allowed just to use it because I don't want to pay for any more page charges, so I'll put it in the supplemental data. No, if you think if it's important enough to the paper to be in the paper, I mean to be needed for the paper, then it should be in the paper. And different journals are really different, and you know, they do with that. But in general, you've got to learn to be very, very concise. You know, it really does take a lot more effort to write a paper for a high impact journal where you've got to get all the important points across and have the impact in a very short, small space. It's like giving a talk at giving a 1 hour seminar versus a 10-minute presentation at a big meeting. You've got to practice an awful lot more for that 10-minute talk.
Oh yeah.
Than you do for the hour. Yeah.
Question. So, in your opinion, like I don't know, whenever you write a paper, how do you decide the order of the authors? So, what are your criteria?
The criteria is who contributed most to the work.
Mm-hmm. So if you have a person who did all the work, but for some reason had to leave, there's another person who wrote the paper.
No, the person who does most of the work should be the
experimental work.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, that's in most scientific journals, that's what you assume, is that the first author is the person who actually sweat it out of the bench. For the most, you know, and it was their baby. The corresponding author is almost always last, and that's usually the person who provided the money and, you know, who had the idea in the first place when they wrote the growth kit, and presumably coordinated the team doing the work. And then people go in order of how much they contributed. Now, there's often a problem where people will say, you know, well, these two guys both contributed equally. And there are some journals that will allow you to say that, but there are also a lot of journals that won't. So.
What about the person who, let's say the paper includes a lot of experiments, massive routine experiments, and they were planned by one of the authors, but were performed by a technician. Will technician be included? Or should technician be included?
If a technician has made a substantial contribution to a paper, that included thinking about it, as opposed to, you know, just pushing the button on the machine, running the centrifuge, then yes, I include my technician.
Okay, running.
But I don't include her on every paper, but I do include her on papers where I think she's made a substantial contribution. I have even, on occasion, she's been first author, because she's been doing the work for me, and nobody else in the lab really worked on it very much. They did a bit, so they'd be on the paper, but not significant. But that's not all that common. Typically, if the technician is not included because everything that they did was routine, and they were not really involved in thinking about the work, which a technician may often well be, then if that's the case, then it's more appropriate to put them in the acknowledgements than in the author list of authors. But in general, you expect when you see the list of authors on the paper, this person did most, this person did the next most, this person did the next most. And then if you've got a collaboration between two groups, right, then you'll have the two senior authors at the end, right? And the one whose group did the most of the work will be the very end, and then the other one will be next in line, and so on up. I mean, that's typically the way it's done. If you're fighting about authorship, then there's a problem probably bigger than just paper.
What about, so, okay, in the lab you can quite easily judge the order. Well, in the ideal case, it's not a problem. But when you collaborate with other people, collaboration may go to performing experiments. Other people perform some experiments, which is definitely inclusion in list of authors. Do you guys have a plasmid? Can you send it over? Is it a collaboration?
Typically not. I give out an awful lot of stuff, an awful lot of cells and recombinant viruses, and I do not wish to be included in the paper.
Not even in the
You do not wish?
Oh, an acknowledgement,
Yes.
yes, different, yeah.
You do not wish to?
No. I mean, I didn't do the work. I didn't have anything to do with the work. I mean, who
But
knows?
if you made the virus, if you designed the virus?
Yeah, which is what mostly were given out. Shortly after we made some of them, yes, I do have some collaborative papers, but no, I send them out around the world, so I certainly don't want to be on everybody's paper that uses it.
But
then they would have to make the virus if you didn't make the
Well,
virus.
yeah, they would, but I know, the science is supposed to be a collaborative
Yes.
effort. We are supposed to be, we do theoretically at least have the same goal, And I got NIH money to make a virus. Seems to me I should give it to other people. Now, a lot of people I give it to are not people in the US, but I don't think I'm going to get excited about that one. I sometimes get a bit ticked off when I'll see people write a paper and refer to the virus and never even mention where it came from.
yes.
I think, who gave you that? I don't think I did.
But you never end up in the circumstances that people ask to have your name on a paper because you're well known in the field and they feel like it increases the likelihood of the paper to be read, that they want your name on the paper and you just say
it's possible, but I mean that's another reason for not doing it, isn't it? Because you really, if you don't know what the people did, okay, and how they did it, and you know a fair bit about them, right? Who knows what you're putting your name on? That's a very dangerous thing to do. I know a lot of people who do demand every time they send out an antibody or something. Their name is on the paper, but I think that's dishonest.
Yeah. I've seen this in the immunology field where I read most. That certain people that I know exactly that they provided mice and then it just says and when in these papers it said that they're supposed to list what they did, provided reagents and discussion or something like that. When I'm pretty sure that it was just the mouse that he provided.
Well, you never know. I mean, we published a paper actually with PNAS a couple of years ago with a fellow at UCSF who I've never met, who sent us some integrally producing cells. But We put him on the paper because he had, given some, considerable amount of input by email. Never, as I said, never met him. And I thought he belonged there. We published in the next paper we published using those same cells. Right? I just thanked him for the cells because he didn't have anything to do with it, and certainly not heard any complaints about it. So so you really don't know because you don't know the history. Yeah. But yes, there clearly are some people that that's only what we have to do.
So if you have people in the lab who do like an extensive work that contributes to the paper, like repetition experiments, but their figures, the quality of their work is not like publication quality, do you put them on a paper or just people?
Well, if their figures are not publication quality, they're not going on the paper.
No, but if you have, like, for example, I don't know, a technician who was doing an experiment like multiple times, but for example, I don't know, grad student did the same experiment and got quality, publication quality figures, so his figure going into a paper, but she did it only once, but then you have like an army of people repeating how those people are going, because they contributed, obviously.
Geez, I don't know. I have to think about that on an individual basis. And, the other thing to remember too, I think, maybe this isn't quite a fair way to look at it, is that the person whose name you're thinking of putting on the paper, how much difference does it make to them if their name is on the paper or not? Now, it probably matters a great deal more to the graduate student than it does to the technician.
If the technician wants to go to med school, they will probably look for...
Well, that's possible, yeah. My technician is 63 years old, so I'm not worried about that.
Yeah, she's not going anywhere now.
But yeah, I mean, that's an issue. But that person isn't going to med school just because their name is on this paper. I hope.
Or in grad school for whatever.
Yeah. I don't know. Those are kind of issues that you have to take up on a one-on-one basis. I don't think they're easy generalizations to make. Life's a whole bunch of value decisions. They're difficult to make.
Question number 5, which is the main and most common mistakes that authors can make. Well, I'm not asking for the list of the top 100 mistakes, but if you would name top 3 or top 5.
Okay. Make absolutely certain that you have not plagiarized yourself or anyone else. When you're writing your 50th paper on the same topic that you've been working on for the last X number of years, you're going to find it extremely difficult to find a new way to say what it is you're working on. However, journals have software. They can put your manuscripts through the software to see if this brings up anything. And even if it's you, that still counts as self-plagiarism. And that is unacceptable. And that's something that a lot of people don't take seriously enough, is making sure that they don't quote directly. If they do quote directly, it's got to be in quotes. And even if it's not in quotes and it's slightly paraphrased, reference it as to where that came from. That's absolutely critical.
I think there's software that you can screen your manuscript before you
There is, and it turns out that that's also being a problem now because there are parts of the world where, if you're Chinese and you're writing a paper in English, it's obviously a great deal more difficult to rewrite than it is.
Oh yes.
And so they will apparently take chunks and then will just modify little bits until it passes the software. Which I think is also a bit dangerous to do. I mean, that is, every time you start to write a new paper, you need to think about it anew. and this is,
Just don't.
difficult to do, and it's particularly difficult to do, of course, when it comes to things like materials and methods, because I mean, how many ways could you say I centrifuged it? And in fact, how many ways should you say it? Because, you know, if you keep changing the wording around, chances are it'll become impossible to figure out what it is you actually did. But you've got an easy way out in the materials and methods, because you say as previously described.
Yes. And I don't, you know, of course, when describing methods, I would feel like, okay, if you're using that, you should be able to basically repeat yourself,
yes.
because you just want to make sure that this is exactly what it's described.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't think most journals have a big problem with that. It's mostly in things like the introduction, that you run into problems, and the discussion, I guess, probably too. But there are, you know, so the Journal of Virology, for example, will flag people. So there are certain authors who come in who are flagged, and all their manuscripts that their names are on have to go through this process before they're sent on to the editors for review. And one person in particular I know quite well, and it's not because he plagiarized anybody else, it's because he got lazy and kept repeating his own phrases. And that's particularly critical if you're writing review articles too. You've got to be very careful. So other mistakes are, read the instructions, yeah. Number the pages. You've no idea how irritating it is to get a manuscript to review, the pages are not numbered. Because you're going to make suggestions, you're going to criticize, right? And you're going to say, where is it in this manuscript, right? So now I've got to go in and I've got to put page numbers on, the idiot who couldn't put them on in the first place. And a lot of journals now ask you, and it's very easy to do, so do it anyway, in Word, which is to number the lines, right? So now the reviewer has to say, page 20, line 33, this sentence makes no sense, you know. And that, you know, because you really want to make things easy for the reviewer. Because if the reviewers get bored or pissed off, or, you know, it doesn't bode well. and unless you've got an extremely conscientious editor with an enormous amount of time on their hands, they're not going to read in detail every paper to make sure the reviewer is being reasonable. I mean, that's the reason you have more than one reviewer, hopefully, so that you pick up those discrepancies. And that's, you know, you get 2 reviews or 3 reviews, however many you want, back to the editor, and then the editor reads those reviews. And it's probably in about maybe 1 out of 3 or 4 papers that I would go back and I'd send the reviews back to the author. Then I'd get the rebuttal back. And then depending on what is in the rebuttal and what's in the reviews, about 1 in 4 papers I'll go back and I'll read myself and try and decide who's right and who's wrong. And if there's a huge disagreement, then I'll send it back again to the reviewers. But if there's not a huge disagreement, and I've already sent it back to the authors saying, you know, please modify the manuscript. It hasn't been rejected. Please modify it according to the reviewers. And then when it comes back, I try not to send it out again. You know, you'll waste the reviewers' time. So, oh yes, you had some of my comments. Oh yes, and then the editor makes the decision. So make it easy. Proofread, proofread, and proofread, and proofread, and proofread again, and make sure that every single author has read it, proofread it, and is agreeing. Because you really are not, you should not be sending out a paper that every author hasn't given you the okay on. In fact, some journals actually require signatures from every author to that effect. So that's important. Make sure you refer to the figures in order, in the text, in the order to which they are numbered. If you find some people will go, figure 1, so, figure 5, think, what is this? You know, this is a sequential thing. check your references, by which I mean read them. You should not be referring to work that you haven't read, because you'd be surprised how many times if you take that reference from another reference who was referring to it because of this person and that person, and you go back and actually read it and find out, good Lord, don't say anything of the sort. You know? So this is a work of scholarship. This is your duty to do.
and you know, I've seen the same authors, you know, use that, you know, same quote, same basically line. There's this about, you know, how many proteins of antigens you ingest. There's this author that wrote about oral tolerance, and in every introduction, she quotes the same article, and I've read that article, and it's nowhere in it. And nowhere mentions. And this author is a very distinguished scholar in her field, you know. And it's still in every paper that she writes, she has that as an introduction about how important this is. But no, it's not there.
And where possible, cite original references rather than reviews. Sometimes that becomes very difficult because your references are limited. You can only use a certain number, so you have to use reviews. But you might bear in mind that the chances are that the person who actually wrote the original reference is likely to be the reviewer. And wants to know, why didn't he review my paper? I did this. He didn't do it, he just wrote a review about it. You know.
But is there any way to, you know, you talk in the introduction, you talk about different things, and in the discussion, you talk about different things. You mention different things. So maybe I don't know, maybe if you talk about the main point of the paper, you better use original experimental papers that were published before. But if you talk about supplemental stuff, something that, you know, and this topic is also important, and you know, it was reviewed there. If you want, you can read it over there.
Yeah.
We're not going to talk about it in details.
Yes, I mean, it depends how much bearing it has on the actual piece of work that you're doing at the moment.
Right.
Is this piece of work really based on this piece of work or on this review arc? No, it's based on this piece of work, and that's what I should be referring to. Yeah, it's sad but true that if you go back, there's an awful lot of science that's just done over and over and over again, because people don't, you know, ever realise that, you know, you could read the literature. It's in there. It was particularly irritating when HIV became a big issue in the late 80s and early 90s, when people started reinventing a lot of viral immunology. There's been an awful lot of really good virus immunology done for the previous 20 years, and the HIV people kind of acted like they were reinventing it all. There was a lot of stuff out there. They were going to cure a complex virus disease with a peptide, that they were going to immunize somebody with, and that was going to be it.
Yeah, it was done.
Come on, didn't we know better than that? Yeah. You said how should reviewers reviews should be addressed. I said number one, very politely, and number two, just arguing with the reviewer is not useful. So even if you're going to explain why this reviewer is full of it, and you've got a very justified explanation, try and find some sentence you can modify in the text. Okay? So you can say that we've considered this point of view and have discussed it briefly in such and such. Because when it goes back to the editor may read that and see, oh yeah, he's right. This reviewer was not correct on this point. So I'll accept it, right? But there's nothing been changed in the paper. So the reviewer doesn't know that I haven't just blown off his comment, right? And that reviewer is maybe somebody whose opinion I really value and whose opinion I need again. Even though in this case maybe they were not entirely justified. So if you've made that slight change, that gives the editor cover. Otherwise, so the editor will feel obliged to send it back to the reviewer, see if the reviewer agrees or not. And you really don't want that if you can prove it. So try to find some way. And you said, especially if the reviewer insists on rejecting the paper without his or her specific corrections. That's entirely up to the editor, not to the reviewer. The reviewer only makes suggestions.
Okay.
So it's the editor who makes the decision.
Rejection.
Yeah. And if you're doing a good job when you get the reviews and you send the letter that goes back to the authors, you will put in that letter what points you really feel they absolutely have to address. So if you read that letter from the editor, you can get a pretty good idea about, I'm not going to get very far if I don't do that. But it looks as though he's not insisting on me doing that. So maybe I can get away with that. So you can tell a lot by reading that letter, unless it's a not very good editor. But most editors spend a lot of time. And so how big is the editor's role? Well, big. The editor makes the final decision.
Okay,
That's
because
where they pay us the big bucks.
well, because we had
Like zero.
I participated in the rebuttal process, and I saw the reviews, and I was thinking whether editor is just a mere communicator between us as authors and reviewers, or we would rather want to say to editor to try to tell him, okay, this is okay point, and reviewer doesn't make any sense,
Yeah, no, the editor makes the final decision. In fact, the editor sometimes makes the first decision. You can have an editorial rejection without it ever going out for review. If the editor takes a look at it and thinks this is rubbish. Now, the editor typically can't do that alone. They've got to get another editor to look at it and see if they agree before that.
Can the editor accept without review?
I don't think I've ever heard of that happening. I guess theoretically, and you could, but I don't know why you would, because you'd have to be awfully sure of yourself to do that. I think you'd still want somebody else to weigh in case there's something that you've missed.
So, out of curiosity, how long, in your work as editor of journal virology, how long time do you give reviewers, or if a reviewer doesn't get back to you within a certain time, do you just rely on the other? If you send it out do you send it out to 2 or 3 usually, or?
I usually send to 2.
Okay, so if one of them doesn't get back to you, do you just rely on that single?
No, never without 2 reviews. Well, there are a couple of ways. First of all, you get to know your reviewers, and in fact, there's if a reviewer has ever reviewed before for that paper, there will be a history there for him. How many they've accepted to review, how many they've cancelled, how many they've refused to review, and what is their average length of time to get the review back. And then you can, if you have particular experiences with them, there's even a place where you can add comments. Don't use this, guys. I'm not actually seeing things like that. So the system that they run at AFM, and I'm assuming that it's relatively similar for most journals. May not be for journals like Nature, are a little different because they have professional editors who are not scientists, so it's very different. The system is set up, it's a computerized system, and so I don't do, it sends me emails when there's a paper coming in that I'm supposed to handle. It'll send me emails when it comes back. It'll send me emails. It sends me a lot of emails. It sends me emails when a review comes in, and then when both of them are in, so now I need to make a decision. And it will automatically, so I go in and I decide who I want to review. The requests go out, and then they will be automatically repeated for a certain number of times if that reviewer doesn't respond, and then it'll come back. Do we need to get out? And then it'll come. Then it'll let me know if that reviewer has not responded at all, and I need to tell me you need to assign somebody else as person to respond. And then they get letters about a couple of days before the review is due, because I sometimes get emails from them saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'll get it back to you." Oh dear, did I send them something? You know, so these are automatic harassments. In fact, we've asked for them to kind of back off a little bit on some of these, because you can't piss people off. So yes, you have to keep tabs on the reviewers, and if it really gets too bad, then sometimes I'll call in a special paper and I'll send something to them and say, "Look, I've been having a lot of trouble getting a review back on this. Is there any chance you could look at this quickly and get it back to me?" You do the best you can, but yeah, it depends on your review. And some people you know not to ask. They may be perfectly appropriate, even the most appropriate reviewers, but if they're going to take 40 days to get back to you, it's not. It's not.
I have a question. It's just the backside. If postdocs become reviewers themselves, just try to do it. So what the most important point that he or she should to know before he will start to review themselves?
Well, first thing you want to do is you need to take a look at the abstract of the paper, because they'll always send you that before you agree to review or not. And make sure it's something you know something about. Make sure it's really in your area. You think you can have a reasonable chance of doing it. And beyond that, I mean, I don't know, when you review a paper, you just need to go through it line by line by line by line. And I usually start listing points as they come to me. And people can do it different ways. And then when you get to the end, typically you're going to make like if you're reviewing a grant, you want to summarize, the main findings and your main opinion in the paper, and then you have a list of specific points you want them to address. Some journals ask you to divide them up to minor points and major points. And you need to remember, whatever you say, it should be polite and constructive. Most journals will have a private section, which is confidential comments to the editor, and that's where you can say, "This is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. Whatever you do, don't publish this." Right? Well, this is brilliant, But keep all those kinds of emotional or emotive comments out of the review. But otherwise, you're just going to go through just like you would in a journal club or anything, bit by bit, and see where there might be problems and where there might not be. And find something nice. You can always find something nice to say.
Yeah, here is just some maybe ethic component ones. If specifically one postdoc has been rejected a couple of times, here it's normal to be a little bit aggressive once he will get a new manuscript to review. So where is this area to be polite and to have a right direction to provide the authors with comments that might to improve the manuscript? Because especially for first time, it's hard to don't be too less aggressive. I mean, I just try to find this area when we are constructive, or we are constructive when manuscript from other authors might be rejected. It's not good if it's because people walk, right? People walk.
Yeah. But I mean, you always need to try to be constructive in some way. That's not to say that you need to write the paper for them or do a piece of work. I mean, it's like when you review grants, they will always tell you, you're not writing this grant for them. You're not telling them what they ought to be doing. You're just telling them what you think of what they are proposing themselves, and then what they choose to do about it is their decision, not yours. So I don't know. I mean, you can be polite, and you can be at least somewhat positive, and at the same time you can still point out what you think are the main problems, because you're not doing the author any favor if you don't really tell them why it is this isn't going anywhere until they do something, which is part of being constructive, in a way, even though it may not. Then, when you're on the receiving end of a review, it never feels very constructive.
This is a little bit related to that question. Just out of curiosity, nothing. Do you notice any tendencies or any trends? I mean, which are more harsh reviewers, younger or older scientists? People that have been in for a long time, or people that are.
In general, younger scientists are a lot harsher.
Yeah, that's right.
It's always, if you have a grant that goes to a study section and it gets written by a reviewer who's only been there a couple of times, watch out. Although the other reviewers will probably take some of that into account. People have a tendency under those circumstances to want to show how smart they are and how they can really figure out what's wrong. So in general, the less experienced, the harsher.
They compensate the lack of experience.
Well, maybe people mellow with age. Or they realize that things aren't quite as black and white as one might otherwise think.
Well, I think we just want to say thank you.
Okay, very well.
Thank you for the terrific talk.